Daren's already started establishing some nice interdisciplinary contacts here in the university, and I thought it would be, we normally try and get our new professors to talk in either the first semester or the second semester. So I'm glad you, like Nori, have a chance to do so, so that more people can also learn about what you're doing right now. It's pretty interesting work what Daren does. He teaches here in public relations, but most of his interests are centered on media, and specifically looking at some areas which are keenly relevant to Paul's work in terms of online communities. More specifically, he's looking at issues related to crowdsourcing and how we can harness the power of online communities for the public good. And this issue of crowdsourcing is something which also was the focus of Daren's dissertation, which was conducted at the University of Utah, which is where he got his PhD. And this involved using the power of online communities, the power of crowdsourcing, so to say, for public transit. This is also federally funded. And Daren's work has been published in a lot of different journals, including Convergence, Information Communication Society, Planning Theory, as well as First Monday. And if I'm not mistaken, I think the article from First Monday already has reached more than 100 citations. So that's pretty impressive. So it's already acquiring a name for his work on crowdsourcing. And he's already, like I mentioned, established some pretty good connections here. And it's a pretty exciting work. And today is going to be talking to us today about what he refers to as a third alternative to traditional modes of communication research. In other words, going beyond just thinking about it in terms of critiquing and analyzing research. So he's talking about it in terms of what he refers to as this really interesting word here, which Rhonda says doesn't exist. Most of us say we don't, but that's what I think is a sniglet. A sniglet is a word which doesn't exist in the dictionary, but which we think should. So designerly ways of knowing communication research and making a case for that. So welcome.
Wow, you just set that up to, so it's all downhill from here.
that was a very good introduction.
Very good, thank you. So designerly, before we start, it's not my word. I didn't invent it. An English guy did, who's an art and architecture design professor. But I'll tell you a little bit more about him in a second. This is Designerly Ways of Knowing Communication Research. I actually ripped that title from this guy as well. Designerly Ways of Knowing was his article. And I would have acknowledged that had you not pointed it out. So, just to be ethical. But what I'm trying to put forth is a case for critical media design, which I think, as far as I can tell, is an approach that deliberately is not really being adopted by a lot of communication researchers. And so I'm kind of hanging this out there in the spirit of what I'm about to tell you about, to kind of see if you can poke holes in it, to please do, to help me push this forward and maybe get something out of it. So here we go. I started with this kind of pie in the sky, rosy, optimistic stuff. I really must point to a book that inspired me. Is one of the few hardcover books that I actually own. But Massive Change by Bruce Mao. He's an architect and ran this institute called the Institute Without Boundaries at the University of Toronto's architecture school. And I was up very late one night, early in my graduate work, listening to some show on PBS where they interviewed him. And he was talking about this book he had just come out with this institute, this research institute. And what this book does is it essentially talks about some of the innovations in the design that are happening now around the world in a variety of areas, in biomedical research, robotics, you name it, and kind of puts forth this kind of ethical call to arms. That is, now that we can do anything, what can we do? Because we can do amazing things, technologically speaking, and if we can't do them now, we're probably on the way to being able to do it soon. And so we need to kind of be more active in designing these types of solutions. So I'll pass it around because it's a very pretty book as well, published by an art publisher, so you can kind of skim through. When this came out, it was about the time I was having an identity crisis in my graduate program. I had a few of those. But the first one was kind of, what am I doing here? It was a very critical cultural program. A lot of rhetorical media criticism was pretty heavy in my department. But we were also blended with traditional kind of mass comm journalism work and public relations. So part of this is kind of the misfit of what I got out of that and some of the work I ended up doing. So to try to retroactively fit it into some sort of a frame, which is what this is really kind of doing. And the other area was I took up a part-time job in graduate studies at Gardner, which is an IT research firm, and I worked on basically the client website, doing usability for them. So I got to kind of see design process happening on a weekly basis, be part of design meetings, and see how really cool things can get done. And the process is very different from the research that we all kind of are familiar with in this discipline. So what am I talking about when I say design? There's a lot of research out there on design method and design theory. The Royal College of Art has had a series of meetings where they've come out trying to define what this is and where it should be in design education. And some authors from that, like Archer and Nigel Cross and Anita Cross, have come out with a lot of these terms like designer lead and different kinds of ways of knowing the world. Design is primarily focused on the conception and realization of new things. So it's focused on making things. We think of design disciplines, we think of architecture, we think of urban planning, we think of people who produce products and make things. So it encompasses an appreciation of material culture, so the things that humans have made, and an application of the arts of planning, inventing, making, and doing. So its focus is very practical, very applied. At its core, the language of modeling, looking at things that already exist, trying to hold up new things that could exist, and testing them along the way and prototyping them through. And it tackles ill-defined or wicked problems. So these are kind of the fuzzy things like how do we solve world hunger? How do we have equal rights? Kind of large major issues. How do we build and sustain an online community, for instance? Which is kind of something that I'm interested in. And at its heart, it's constructive, it's normative, so there are values laden in this kind of research, which might make some people uncomfortable. It's creative and it's optimistic. So fundamentally, as critical as I can be and as pessimistic as I can be, fundamentally I kind of adopt a very optimistic role that we can do things with technology like cure diseases and solve world hunger. If we take this and break it down, and I realize this is kind of a rough approximation, if we have arts and humanities research as kind of understanding the field of human experience, it values subjectivity, imagination, commitment, and a concern for justice, and the types of skills that come out of this are things like criticism and analogy and evaluation. Following that through, do we buy that, I guess, is the question? Is this believable? Yeah?
They're exclusive categories?
Not necessarily. These kind of tend to be, I think, dominant paradigms. And again, a lot of this is from the designers who've come up with trying to argue that this is the third way. With science and social science, you have the concern with the natural world or the behavior of humans, that kind of thing. Valuing objectivity, rationality, neutrality, and a concern for the truth, replication of experiments, that kind of thing. Experimentation, classification, analysis, describing the known world, organizing it, that sort of thing. But if we look at technology and design, we have kind of a different take on all this. Concern with the artificial human-made world, so things that we make, things that we do, things that we're in charge of happening. Valuing practicality and ingenuity and empathy, and a concern for appropriateness. So does this solve the problem? Kind of more holistic questions. And the types of skills that are inherent in design work tend to be modeling, pattern forming, and synthesis. So not identifying patterns, but making them. Not analyzing, but synthesizing, bringing together different bits of information into new things. You buy this so far? No? Come on, give me some feedback. So, to be blunt, I guess, the natural sciences are concerned with how things are designed. It's more focused on how things ought to be. And Sidney Gregory is kind of one of the major names in the design method and design theory area. But I think what becomes kind of a sticky point for some folks who especially may come from behaviorist forms of research focused on objectivity and more scientific approaches is that this ought to be thing is kind of sticky. So according to who? What is ought? And this is kind of where my critical bent comes in. Critical theory, are we familiar with this, I guess? Yes, no? What kind of dose do you get this? If we, and again, this is kind of a summary of lots and lots of literature at very top levels, but if critical scholars acknowledge that there are power imbalances in the world, there are either haves and there are have-nots, there are people who are downtrodden and people who are in power who exploit that. And this power is kind of unjustly distributed over society. Think about working class exploitation, racism, sexism, all the isms in the world as kind of examples of this. These power imbalances have material historical roots. So when we think about racism, why are we racist? Well, it goes way back. There's history behind this. There's people who had so-called rational thoughts about why it was right to justify one race or the other in terms of power. So there's definitely a focus on that, on the human effects on these types of material historical roots. And the imbalance of this power is often, it can be maintained through brute force, but is often maintained through hegemony and ideology. So if hegemony is kind of the ideological force that convinces people to consent to their own oppression, the fact that we willingly go to work and slave over whatever it is we do and don't fight back for workers' rights, or the fact that we kind of accept kind of dominant myths about the self-made man, that I'll work hard because someday I'll become rich, kind of glosses over a lot of the realities and the historical material conditions behind why that isn't so likely. So we often are kind of holding ourselves in place in these oppressive arrangements. Religion plays a lot of part in this, education, the family, other types of ideological apparatuses as a result. The critic is kind of an important player in this, and this is where I guess I'll start to talk more about comm studies and speech comm folks in tension with mass comm research. And again, none of these are kind of complete, whole, absolute kind of categories, but tend to be what I think are dominant conversations in these disciplines. The critical scholars see themselves not just as observing or describing the injustices, but they see themselves as active in trying to fix them. They want to intervene in these problems. So it's not just okay to say, this is racist, this text is racist, this movie portrays people in racist ways. There's a responsibility that a critical scholar should be taking on, that is to intervene, to do something about it. So definitely not objective. Objectivity is really kind of a giant myth in general in terms of what scholars believe in the critical tradition, and what I think a lot of people truly deep down believe, I hope. But the subjectivity is kind of a major player. Scholars see themselves as meaningful actors in the research they do, and as taking kind of active roles in intervening. Theory building is, do you have a question? Yep.
Yeah. You're a critical scholar?
I like to think so.
So, aren't you the man?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you're a white guy standing there in a suit-like thing
Yeah.
in a university that values all kinds of traditional things such as education, and it pays you benefits and gives you a parking spot if you pay $700 to $800 a year.
Yes.
So, which one are you, the problem or the solution?
I'm part of the problem. I'm part of the problem, but can take active steps to trying to fix it.
So your categories being part of the problem or part of the solution are fluid. You're not automatically.
Yeah, I think you're kind of part of both. We're all part of the problem, right? I mean,
Some more than others.
yeah, no, I think
I just wondered where you situated yourself.
Problem. Problem working towards solution. So I think, it's a good point. I think scholars see themselves, in the behaviorist tradition at least, the scientific kind of approach, the scholar's kind of up there doing an experiment, sets up something that can be replicated and kind of done by any scientist, no matter their skin color, their age, their whatever. And so science kind of stands on its own, detached from the scholar. But that's really faulty, right? I mean, we all, it is. If we make up when we explicate a concept for a survey, let's say, we go and we say, this is what this word means, this is what this value means, the research has shown this. But to kind of hold that up as an objective truth ignores the fact that the research that is before, the building blocks of it, were made through privilege. The fact that, going back to some of the roots of this, women didn't have as much access to the academy. People of color didn't have as much access to the academy. It's mostly written in English, right? There's a lot of kind of ways you can interrogate the building blocks upon which those concepts sit, okay? And then when it comes down to what do we determine is counts or doesn't count, right? I mean, if we say, to say I'm going to do a study of media violence in a movie, I'm going to count the number of times that violence occurs. Well, how do you determine what violence is? I mean, some of it's so faulty. Is it anytime you see blood, anytime you see someone punch somebody, yell at each other, and so on? And what those kind of categories tend to do is privilege what someone else has said is part of this category, right? So somebody might say violence is only when people shoot guns and stab each other. But somebody who may have lived through verbally abusive arrangement would say, oh no, yelling is violence, right? And so I think when you step back and you really critique at its roots, I don't know if there's ever really truly objective research and objective kind of claims that can ever be made. And so yes, I'm part of the problem, right? I'm a white male. I teach at a research university, publicly funded, right? I have an office, wear jackets, right? I have all the kind of markers of privilege in society, right? But as long as I acknowledge that, I at least take one more step towards trying to ameliorate that problem. Does that make sense? All right, awesome. Critical scholars at least should be less concerned with theory building up front, less concerned with kind of testing hypotheses, and more concerned with kind of grounded work, theory that emerges from the observation of data, from the creation of data. That isn't always the case necessarily, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the critic should, at the end of the day, be asking kind of a big so what question. And not so what in the fact that, so what does this add to our knowledge of theory, right? Not so much that, but more, so what does this do to fix the oppressive circumstance you wrote about? So if you're writing about, this movie's so racist, I keep going back to this, because I'm guilty of having done this. Plenty of work up to about first year of my dissertation work, or PhD. If you write about, this character in this movie is so racist, shame on Hollywood for making these types of scripts and perpetuating these stereotypes. Well, so what? Right, what has the critic done to actually intervene in that? Did they go to Hollywood and meet with these screenwriters to try to write new characters? No, that almost never happens, right? Did they go and they make their alternative answer to it? Rarely does that actually happen. So, though I think I kind of agree in spirit with a lot of the critical, particularly speech comm and rhetorical criticism work, I'm really frustrated by its lack of doing, its lack of actual intervention. And it kind of is satisfied at the level of discourse, kind of intervening in the language of discourse, which I think only goes so far. Okay, moving on. In loudest critics in media studies, the critical media studies approach can use kind of rhetorical methods, semiotics, that kind of thing. Tend to be the speech comm and comm studies folks, which incidentally, we have some of the best in the world at this university who are kind of leading voices in this area. And their work has purpose and it has value and I love it. But I think we can do more, and we ought to do more. And if one really embraces the critical tradition, it should really kind of push the boundaries of that. Film scholars do a lot of this as well, except they're a little bit more likely to do film and create documentaries and create answers to these things. Brian Ott is a rhetorical critic in Colorado who I love. He wrote an essay called Relocating Pleasure in Critical Media Studies that critiqued kind of this problem as he saw it. It's a critical theory which animates so much of the recent scholarship in media studies has, I fear, become stagnant, sterile, even stereotypical. And what tends to happen in some of these articles tends to be, look at this awful product, this awful media product. By pointing it out, I'm revealing the answer and the fact that we need to not be making more of these products. And then it's left alone. It's a very ivory tower approach to academia, not very practical at all, and it kind of, I think, betrays the roots of what all this should really be. So those are media critics. Love them or hate them. To be fair, though, I think it's not right to kind of just dismiss it without kind of talking about the mass comm journalism side, and there are good examples of this that I think happen. Crystal Brent-Zook, who's a journalist and also adjunct at Hofstra University, wrote a really good book, for instance, called Color by Fox, where she looks more at the production and the audience's side of the media process and not so much just at the text and the notion of the text. So she looked at, for instance, what went on behind the scenes at Fox when a bunch of black programming took over in the 90s on their channel. Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Living Single, those types of shows, which, and unusual for the moment, were actually produced, written, acted by, starring African Americans that touched on issues facing the black community in very head-on ways. And she talks about how, for instance, once Fox acquired the NHL rights, they abandoned these programs and canceled them for pursuit of different audiences. But this is kind of an example of how critical work can take shape, not as a rhetorical critic, but from kind of political economic production side of media. too. So there are ways to do this. Documentaries are also kind of good ways, I think, to intervene and inject kind of critical discourses into things, to create kind of new alternatives to the way that we can view the world. A lot of respect for documentarians in that way. So I guess the question is, if speech comm approaches to media, the comm studies approach to media, seem to critique without offering a lot of solutions, and certainly not a lot of actual doing of solutions, not a lot of making, except for maybe the documentarians. And if mass comm approaches to media, especially in the scientific, what's really dominant in a lot of these conferences, what's dominant in the school, I get the sense, is focus on building theory, really problem-focused and not solution-focused, focused on kind of understanding the nature of how something is happening, rather than how to build on it. But I think the question is, why can't we do a third way, right? And the design studies, design methods, design theory folks have really tried to put this forth as a third way of knowing, a third way of education from the kindergarten level and up, since the last few decades at least. Why can't we take this concept and really actively translate it to communication research, really do this kind of approach? It's messier, it's risky, it fails a lot, it's fun, and I think there are some pretty good examples of what this is. So, and by the way, we have the technology to do this. Going back to the beginnings of computing, for instance, the beginnings of the internet, we have some really rosy, optimistic language that was applied to this. These are things that augment human intellect and extend us. These are ways that we can expand our brain and our knowledge and our capacity to solve problems. So there's definitely kind of a predecessor to this in some media research that I think gets ignored along the way, or gets kind of put down as being too rosy. But new media technologies are, they're growing in number, they're getting more sophisticated, they're easy to use. When I taught a web design course, it was like HTML in Dreamweaver, which we thought was the way to teach it. And just a year or two later, that's just not the way that we teach it. We teach WordPress, we teach Joomla, we teach content management systems, because that's a better way to do it. And some of the stuff eventually just teaches itself. I have a number of students who taught themselves the programs that they use. They taught themselves Photoshop. They taught themselves WordPress before we had a chance to formally teach them. So people are starting to develop kind of innate skills of these media. They're getting more widespread, and they're getting inexpensive. So prices drop, power grows, all that kind of stuff. And of course, if you can't do it, and I don't think it's reasonable to expect every media scholar to actually do their own material, right? It's time consuming, they probably don't do it as well, but you can always hire this out, and that price is kind of dropping, and the capabilities are going up. Yes?
What is it?
If
we can't make it.
If we can't make these technologies, these new media technologies, websites, mobile apps.
But you're referring specifically to solution type technologies. That's
yeah, I guess tools is probably the best.
Tools
is probably, if we can't make the tools, the new media tools are becoming easier to use, but even if we don't have the time or money or talent, we can always hire that out. There's no reason we can't work with interdisciplinary teams to do this. There's no reason we shouldn't work with artists to develop good interfaces and attractive logos for things, and work with business scholars to make sure that we can market the thing or whatever it is. And so, my big question is, why not just do it, right? It's a few $1,000s to hire out the development of a really awesome looking website that can do, excuse me, what did I just do? That can do some really amazing things, and we can study and gather tons of data with, so why not, right? So here's kind of, I guess, a step-by-step of how I think we could approach our research in a designer way, like it's an apparel, it's a label. So first things first, start with a really messy problem, a wicked problem as they call them. This is just a graphic grabbed from Wired when they asked some technology folks what they thought were the biggest problems today. So a lot of very technology oriented, but start with something messy, something you care about. If you're interested in health and health access, ask questions like, how do we get XYZ groups of people access to this health? Just ask a big broad question and work from there. Don't ask really micro level things, like how does a message get received by somebody? Or how does, and don't paralyze yourself with critique about messages you're sending out. We'll start with that. The next thing, use existing knowledge to fill the gaps in your knowledge. This isn't so much about explicating concepts or about setting up hypotheses, but ask broad questions, and when you don't know the answer to something, go look it up and see what else has been done. Look at other cases, look at other models that have been executed in whole, and see what you can learn from them. I'll show some examples in a sec that really started from looking at what was working elsewhere and just trying to replicate it to some extent for a new problem set. Third, do a posit hole solutions while using existing tools and processes and kind of rapid prototyping. This is the kind of thing that would happen in for instance, usability. If you're designing a new interface for an app or a website, you would sketch it out first, do paper prototyping. This kind of comes from literally sitting in with people and saying, here's what I think we're going to do with our website. Where would you go if you wanted to access your login page? And then have them point to the page and trade out the screen and say, okay, that would take you here. Now what would you do? So they can be done very quickly, very cheap and dirty, to see how people would navigate these interfaces and how they think, to illustrate the idea that we can rapidly prototype these types of things very quickly. Then actually build it. So follow through and just make the thing. And there's money for this, some other kind of benefit to this type of research. But actually make the thing and roll it out, disseminate it, test it, pilot it with a few people beyond your prototyping, and just see the thing work. Put it in an app store and see who downloads it, and so on. These types of problems generate a lot of data if they're done properly. So when you set them up, you can set up mechanisms for capturing a lot of data within IRB guidelines, of course. But you can set up, and you can also generate a lot of text, a lot of content that can be analyzed from that approach as well. And you can contact people for interviews and execute surveys of people who use the tool to find out how and why they did it. So there's a lot of opportunities to approach these types of whole products that you put out, these whole solutions, to still kind of feed the ideological beast that is tenure, right, at a traditional research university, which is cranking out studies, finding out how these things really work in a much more messy at the beginning way that gets refined over time. And at the end, make sure that you can look back and improve upon what you learned. Do it better the next time, be critical and self-reflexive. So understanding what your role may have been in the design of the tool might have emulated kind of your values and your way of looking at things. And loop what you've learned, in that case, back into a new technology. It becomes part of the knowledge that you use to fill your future gaps. This is a nice Ouroboros snake thing. So here's the kind of situation again. So let me show you 4 examples, because I think this has been kind of pie-in-the-sky abstract. And so here's a few examples that I think fit this. A couple of them are some of my work. Not that I'm the exemplar of this, but I think what I'm doing is a little different in the way that I approach these studies. So I'll talk about those in the second, or the third and fourth one. But we'll start with Cambodia, and then go to Safe to P. P, yes. And then we'll talk about my next stop design case, and then a project I'm working on right now with Kurt Rubisil in the Public Health School. Okay, so the first example here is RDI, Resource Development International in Cambodia. This is an organization that is dedicated to public health. They do a lot of public health research, and they analyze water samples and soil samples, and they do that kind of work. But what they also have going on is education that happens with people in the area using a studio. So they produce television shows that educate children on what's happening. And one of the more interesting things is this karaoke series they have. So in Cambodia, and a lot of the countries down in the Southeast Asia region flowing out of the Himalayan mountains, just because of geology, there are large amounts of sediment containing arsenic in the soil and in the bedrock of these countries. And Cambodia is particularly hard hit. 75 to 100,000 people have arsenicosis, huge kind of arsenic intake over several years from the drinking water. So decades ago, religious missions and aid workers went in and dug these wells for people so that they could use groundwater to wash their clothes and eat and drink. And what happened was they didn't realize that they were cutting through major deposits of arsenic in the soil. So these wells become basically arsenic, 5 times the amounts that are saved. This causes kind of long-term skin issues and can lead to a bunch of internal cancers. And some rural villages especially are very hard hit. Every house tends to have one person who's very sick from this. And they go around and they've now started to spray paint these faucets with red to indicate that they're poisoned, and they're trying to educate people not to use them. Now, why do they not just close them off? Because they still need them to wash their clothes and other things. It's not like they're not safe to do that. It's just not safe to drink. So the education campaign, what this organization did was observe what people in the community liked, what they were drawn to, what they did. Children aspire to be karaoke stars in Cambodia. It's kind of awesome. Karaoke is kind of a national pastime. It's a thing that people do in communities. There's a documentary made about this. This is how I kind of found out about this case. A documentary called Born Sweet by Cynthia Wade. I was going to show a trailer, but you can look it up on your own. And it follows the kind of life of this boy and the work that RDI is doing. It's a short documentary. And I saw it at Sundance last year when I lived in Utah, which is another benefit to living in Utah. And so one of the benefits. What RDI is doing is using karaoke to create songs about how to avoid the red drinking water wells, and kind of disseminating this to kids, going out in the community, meeting with parents and giving them kind of more traditional workshops and lectures on what not to do and what's safe and what's not, but really reaching kids by showing them in these mobile vans, TVs that are embedded in the backs of these vans with karaoke machines and so on, and letting people play with these original songs they've created and let kids sing along to them. So I see this as a particularly interesting case, very simple really at its core, letting, where they tackled this problem kind of head on and developed a communication-based, media-based strategy for intervening in the problems that are going on, this public health issue. There's already at Cambodia. Safe to pee, covering on this is interesting. Yes?
Are they doing anything to provide water to drink to the population?
They also have a branch going on that's developing, working on soil tests and water tests and trying to figure out better ways to find good spots to drill wells. The problem is, though, the soil apparently is really checkered with large deposits that it's hard to know how deep to go, how shallow to go, and that kind of thing. So they are still doing that kind of end of it. But I think the branch that they have going on that gets a lot of visibility, that generates a lot of donations for them, is their studio side, right? Which also includes puppet shows for kids and all that kind of stuff that they broadcast. Okay? Any other questions so far? All right. Safe to pee. Love this one. Safe to pee. The problem that some LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer advocacy groups tried to tackle head on was this notion of unisex bathrooms for transgender people. So if you're transgender, it's difficult to find a bathroom that may fit how you view yourself. And it's safer to go to a place where nobody's going to beat you up for walking in the wrong bathroom or try to arrest you. So a unisex toilet, a private toilet, would be kind of the ideal for a transgender person. But it's hard to know where these bathrooms are, right? Usually when you see just one unisex bathroom, it's in a very small establishment. So you have to kind of have gone to the coffee shop to know the bathroom exists. So what Safe to Pee did, I love the organization's name, they launched a website and a mobile app, and on the left is kind of a screenshot of what the mobile site looks like, where you can enter your address, and I just entered Carver zip code, and it will pop out a map and a listing of places that have user-submitted unisex toilets. So now you know exactly within what range the nearest safe bathroom is. And a number of colleges have started doing things like this for their campuses specifically. UNC, I think, is going to roll out their app soon, or roll out their website at least, and I'm sure it can integrate to this. They make everything open, and it's very copyleft. APIs out there. People can adapt this data as they want and add to it and submit their ideas. And they've also turned it into a game of sorts. So they have a leaderboard. People who have submitted the most number of resources get their username listed in kind of the top Hall of Fame number of high-powered submitters. But Safe to Pee is kind of one of these organizations. There are several like this. We're trying to tackle head-on in a holistic way the very real problem that transgender people face when they need to use a public restroom. So I hold this up as kind of a good example of critical media design. Now, both of these examples so far really haven't been done by media scholars, and I think that says a lot about the potential for media scholars to intervene in this way. But they're starting to study the use of the site. It's getting a lot of traffic, and it helps campus programs, for instance, reach out to LGBTQ populations better especially transgender segments of the population. Next stop design was a project I did. This was basically the basis of my dissertation. My dissertation was running this case, this entire project, and analyzing kind of the outcomes, interviewing people, looking at the use data to find out how and why they use this site and if it was effective. So the challenge here was how do we improve using new technologies, public participation programs for transit planning? Kind of dry, but that was the challenge. And the Federal Transit Administration accepted ideas on this, and ours ended up getting funded, which was great. What this is we started by looking at existing business models using crowdsourcing, specifically threadless.com, which is a t-shirt company, where people can submit their ideas for t-shirt designs and then vote on the ideas of others in a gallery online, and then the top-rated shirts at the end of the week get printed by Threadless and sold back to the community. We looked at this model and wanted to translate what was really working well for business, for Threadless, generating a lot of profits, to see if it could be used for something for the public good, to allow kind of more of a democratic voice in the design of public space. So we focused on bus stop shelters, which are wonderfully complex but contain problems. How do you make a better bus stop shelter that protects you from the weather in better ways, the changing weather in Utah specifically at the time, or keeps you safe, has amenities like wireless internet access and bus arrival times and that kind of thing. And we opened it up to an online community and said, come submit your idea and then vote on it in the gallery. And what you think is the best idea will be declared the winner. Now, we didn't have the authority to say that UTA, the transit authority in Utah, would actually make them, and so far they haven't and probably won't. But nonetheless, without any kind of real motivation to promise to build it, no cash award, nothing other than public recognition, we got 260 designs submitted in the course of 4 months from 3,200 users who registered on the site for free. So it was enormously successful in one way, and we brought in a lot of new voices. Part of this kind of illustrates how you can run parallel research studies on these types of cases as you execute them. The research process for me included looking at user registration data. So in order to act on the site, in order to submit your designs or vote on the designs of others or comment on designs, you had to register a username. And part of the registration process included an IRB waiver, but also OIRB. But you also had to answer some questions that said, how often had you previously ridden the bus before? Have you ever been involved in a traditional public planning meeting, such as a workshop or a design charrette or a town hall meeting? And all those types of things, demographics, location. And so we were able to notice from that as well that about 2/3 had never previously attended a public meeting, so we reached new voices. There's a very young group that came, much younger than you typically see at traditional planning meetings. And the participation was kind of immense. We also had international traffic to the site, which we didn't intend, but made for an interesting data set. It was definitely kind of one of the failures of this, but produced a lot of interesting findings on how to design these things better in the future. And then also the wealth of images that were produced. Every design submission had at least one, sometimes 3 images that they submitted of their bus stop. And some of them were 3D renderings, most of them were actually. And so you can analyze this and code these for common features. What are the things that people really want? Well, a lot of them mentioned green building things, solar panels. A lot of them mentioned lighting and safety and visibility. A lot of them mentioned shielding from the weather. So you can look at all this and analyze what do people really want, in addition to who actually won the contest, to find out what people's ideal bus stops really look like. So in a lot of ways it kind of informs a public participation process and information gathering process that UTA was hoping to do to figure out how to build better bus stop shelters. So scale this up and you could potentially redesign entire transit systems.
Why isn't it being implemented? Money?
UTA, yeah. On camera. Utah Transit Authority was initially on board, very much behind the project. We actually had connections to UTA and they were very excited about it. And then later on kind of they clamped down on what was going on and didn't really want to do anything with it. And so even though it was framed as, if it fails, we'll take the responsibility, our team of researchers for screwing this up, but if it succeeds, you can take all the glory. It still didn't really seem to inspire UTA to want to actually do anything. And they're redesigning that entire part of the city where this bus stop was actually going to be placed. So it's not like they're unnecessarily tearing down a bus stop. They're doing it anyway. So that is a good question about why it wasn't built. Yes?
I wonder about the ethics of getting the community really invested and involved in like making change and getting them to kind of feel like this is going to happen and then not actually doing it.
Yeah. No, and that came up in some interviews I did with people. And they said, well, why isn't this being built? I thought this was going to be built. We had this spelled out on the site pretty clearly. It was part of the, you do understand this, there's no compensation, we're not going to promise to build this, you're not going to get the contract. It's just literally, we're going to put out a press release that says you won. And people did it anyway. And I think people were kind of duped by that, but I think the lesson is it's got to be more prominent. People have to know up front that they're not, bold flashing letters even, not as part of a typical kind of registration process. So the ethics of that are questionable. And there's an ethical question here of, is this efficient? Is it efficient to have minds toiling away for hours and hours with these creative skills to produce 260 bus stops, even if one was actually built? Is it fair to the other 259 times,
Well, there are other
$5 sales
states
there?
other than Utah.
That's true.
Even other states with snow.
That's true. And
so,
one of the designers from India, who won second place, I think, did try to shop the design out to their city, from what I last heard. So, it might not have been a total waste for the people who submitted these designs, but ethically speaking, there are questions. But what I think these kinds of fuzzy problems and fuzzy one-off attempts to solve them show is that there really are a lot of cracks. And so going forward to redesign a system, we know exactly what kind of questions to ask, ways to reiterate, or ways to execute more of a traditional scientific study to find out what people really value or which messages work on screen better, that kind of thing. So it kind of it opens up numbers of lines of research. It's a good question, though.
Karen, do you have more information about the demographics of the individuals who participated?
Yeah, they were mostly young. I think roughly about 2/3 were under the age of 35, which is wildly different from who actually goes to public planning meetings in Utah, or anywhere really. And only about half of them, about 45%, were from the U.S., which I think was interesting given that it was a local bus stop. And even smaller than that, I think just 3% were from Utah. So that's its whole discussion in itself, is can you ever have a locally focused participation project opened up on the global platform of the internet? Probably not, unless you have certain filters in place, which we didn't. But it was a pretty diverse group. We had 127 countries. Do what?
What about race and income?
Race and income, we didn't ask income. We did ask race, but then, because we didn't anticipate getting international participation, the racial categories are all based on U.S. definitions of race, which in themselves are already very muddy. But of U.S. participants who answered the questions, it was actually fairly representative. So the percentage
of Utah
of the U.S. So people who came from the U.S. who answered the race question, it tended to actually fairly represent the rest of the U.S. So that was good as well. Internationally, that doesn't make sense. If you're from India and it says African American, how do you check that, right? If you're neither African or American, and it doesn't have any cultural context. So yeah, it was a mix. And gender was fairly balanced on the site in terms of registration data, but in terms of people who were willing to be interviewed, it was mostly men. And I don't know why that is. Other questions? Okay. So a project I've got going on, this is Kurt Riebesil. I don't know if he approves of me putting up his picture, but there it is. Nice guy, School of Public Health here at UNC. He and I are working on a project right now to propose for funding called Mobilizing Youth for Tobacco Regulation and Compliance, or MyTrack. All the projects in this area have to have acronyms that are cute. But what we're doing is we're taking a site called C-Click-Fix and working off of these principles and working off of some other game platforms for mobile apps. C-Click-Fix is a crowdsourcing endeavor where people can report non-emergency issues in their city. So if you see graffiti on a wall or a pothole in the ground or an unsafe traffic light or whatever it might be, you can snap a photo of it or report it with text back to a central area that your city can see. And some cities actually subscribe to this service as a way to allocate their resources and allocate priorities for fixing things. But what it acts as kind of as an intelligence gathering function for a city to help run better. So they know where the potholes are, where the graffiti is, that kind of thing. It helps gang units identify emerging turf wars and so on with graffiti and all of that. So we're taking this principle of kind of distributing this massive problem of watching over the city. And it splits it up into cell phones, individual cell phones all around the city of people who are willing to participate. We're going to try to take this to youth, and there are some pretty active anti-tobacco youth groups in various cities in North Carolina who Kurt Rubis has already worked with, who are willing to kind of take this on, and we're talking to them later today actually, to use them as the test base for this. But there's a number of regulations and laws in place that prohibit certain advertising in certain places at the point of sale of tobacco. So convenience stores are a large kind of focus for this. You have advertising everywhere, and a lot of that's changing, and there are new laws rolling out. Meanwhile, the people who regulate this often can't get back to a certain convenience store within 5 years to check it out. So they're really understaffed, and the intelligence kind of gathering function is just not there. So what we're going to do is develop an app like this that allows youth in these groups, to start with, to report violations, to snap photos, to write in and say, there was an ad that was here, or I was able to access my own cigarettes, which you're not allowed to do anymore, or there was a picture of Joe Camel at 3-foot eye level under the counter, and that's not allowed. So they get to kind of report these issues back to a central area, which can then inform the regulators on how to better tackle these problems. And we're going to design a game mechanism, a way for motivating youth to kind of compete for points. You know, you get more points for uploading a picture of the evidence. You get more points for visiting convenience stores we still need to get. And there'll be some redundancy measures in place. You know, once it's gathered 3 reports, we know it's probably valid if they all agree. That kind of thing. And award points and see if there's a prize system or something associated with that for youth to use. And so it's muddy. It's going to be a one-off app to just get made. And we're going after funding to do this and see what comes out of it. And along the way, study, of course, its effectiveness, people's motivations to use it, how effective all the different elements were, and of course, performance. Did it actually report more violations than the regulators would have found on their own in a 5-year period? So we're doing that hopefully soon with some blessing from folks with money. And I see this as kind of an extension of this critical media design approach, this doing approach, and studying later. So there's a lot of benefits to this kind of work, as I see it. If you take big steps to approach wicked problems, you can fail miserably, which frequently happens. Or you can fail in kind of partial ways, which I think Next Stop Design did. Or you can have massive successes. If you take baby steps towards something, you're really sure about the steps you're taking, but you don't get very far very fast. If you take big steps, you fail a lot, but when you do make a big step, you succeed wildly. This is kind of the DARPA funding model for defense. It's kind of a widely known model of innovation that can pair well with more traditional forms. And even when you fail, you get a lot of research. I mean, Next Stop Design's failures, I think, were amazing learning experiences for producing better goods in the future. The results you get are practical and useful and immediate. So if the app works and it's already out there, it's out there. You can tweak it and it's still out there. And it can work and it's usable right then and there. Another positive thing, something that faces anyone with a budget crisis, this brings in a lot of funding. Agencies are really excited about funding practical kind of things that can take off very quickly, very inexpensively. And so, for instance, health organizations would be very likely, I hope, to fund something like MyTrack because it has kind of a real application right away. It also creates interdisciplinary teams and interdisciplinary work, which leads to innovation. If you've read the innovation roadmap that our Chancellor Thorpe, has put out, this is exactly the kind of stuff he's talking about if you read between the lines. The work he uses, or the words he uses, are creative, synthesis, interdisciplinary, doing, making, intervening. It's actually, the document itself has a number of social justice themes, a number of critical themes that really kind of move beyond, I think, the two kind of paradigms of art and science. Technology commercialization, scaling up. Again, if these apps work, they can be scaled up, they can be put into practice. Could even generate revenue streams, if appropriate, for the certain people who funded them or who were affected by them. And then we also have, here in the journalism school, the Reese Feltz Digital Newsroom. We have, and I see this as a huge benefit for the school, we have a place where we're supposed to be playing, where we're supposed to be going and saying, I have this wild idea, let's test this news form. Let's see if it works, and we'll study it. Okay? These whole one-off efforts, we have places for this already. So not only are there funding mechanisms elsewhere, we also already have a venue here in our school. So I'd like to see, hopefully going forward, more and more faculty and grad students approach places like Reese News to try and say, let's try this. It's wild, it will probably fail, but let's give it a whirl. And it could be kind of the next breakthrough in advertising for journalism or telling stories. So that's it. And I really would welcome your questions. As you can maybe tell from the way I presented this is kind of an early first attempt at trying to articulate kind of a complicated thing that I've been stewing in for a long time. I'd hope to take this and formalize it a bit, or at least get feedback on some of the projects that, or the project that I'm pursuing right now with my track. So thanks. Questions, please. Critiques, please.
Really?
Yeah, really.
Your opening slides put up this big idea that these are the categories. And I was a little put off by that, but I cannot argue with the excitement behind some of the things you're doing, even though I don't necessarily know that that's exactly what I think the main problem in the world is. Y'all have this idea of this is an issue we have with teens being advertised to. I'm thinking, oh wow, when I was a kid, I would use wanted some kind of app. Where can you go buy cigarettes? Where can you buy beer when you're underage? But
right.
Whatever, this is the problem you've identified, not the other problem. And so,
well, and that's the thing is that anyone can twist this to their view of what justice is, right? There's justice.
Well, I don't know.
There's ethical problems.
Justice is short-term problems, but I think it's absolutely exciting that you are on the ground and wanting to use technology to do something. But I don't see that is in conflict with some of the more basic research that, because I think to understand what type of advertising is harmful to youth, some of that basic research can tell you versus just going out and saying if it's at this height, I mean, you're applying the law there. What's illegal to do, what the courts have decided, or FDA, or one of those regulatory organizations.
And the law is based on simple research too. The real basic things, like if it's at eye level with a child, they'll buy some cigarettes.
Right, but some of that basic research, I think putting it in a laboratory and trying to be a little more objective about it rather than saying, I think this is the problem, so let's design research to solve. I think that a lot of this can come out of basic research where objectivity is not a problem. I don't know that I see an either or a view of the world, that you should do it this way instead of that way. Why not have people who do both?
I don't think I see it as an either or either.
Your category, you have lines, you have dotted lines,
yeah, I did.
solid lines.
They should have been permeable
and
in their brains.
you set it up that this is the way it is, but why shouldn't it be this way?
Right.
So you put value judgment in there.
No, I did.
Mr. White Guy.
I did, and I value that. I mean, I value. If I didn't make it clear which types of research I valued over others, I'd be lying to you, right? This is the kind of research I value, is the doing the practical. Now, I don't think that that a laboratory experiment that comes up with some really interesting contributions to theory that can inform the way we design these things, that shouldn't be diminished. I don't think we should get rid of it. And I don't necessarily think we should get rid of, a rhetorical critic who, or an artist. I don't want to get rid of these things. I'm just saying that there's maybe a more, there is a middle kind of path that can be walked. And from it, I see lots of other studies that can be attached to it. So there's no reason why, for instance, you